The bell above the door of Blue Horizon Diner chimed with its familiar metallic ring. It was not the cheerful sound it was designed to be 40 years ago when Frank McLaren first installed it. Now it was a tired, worn sound that announced the arrival of another customer needing coffee, another plate to carry, another dollar, hopefully added to the tip jar. Except this time the bell announced something else entirely. Sarah Miller was refilling Mrs. Abernathy's coffee when she heard the bell. She didn't look up immediately. Tuesday mornings were steady but manageable. Nothing special about a Tuesday in October. The morning rush had subsided, and she was mentally calculating how many hours she would need to work to cover her mother's latest hospital bill. It was only when the diner fell unnaturally silent that Sarah looked toward the door. 4 men in impeccable black suits entered first. They moved with military precision, scanning the room with watchful eyes behind dark sunglasses. 2 positioned themselves at the door while the others stepped aside to allow a 5th man to enter. He was older, perhaps in his mid-50s, with steel gray hair and a face that belonged on Mount Rushmore. Solid, weathered, commanding. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of wealth and power. In one hand, he carried a pristine leather briefcase. Every patron in the diner stared. The breakfast crowd at Blue Horizon consisted mostly of factory workers, retirees, and the occasional commuter heading into Boston. These men looked like they had stepped out of a different world entirely. The man in the charcoal suit surveyed the diner until his eyes found Sarah still holding the coffee pot frozen in place. He walked directly towards her, his leather shoes making purposeful sounds on the worn linoleum floor. The 2 men followed a few paces behind their presence, drawing all the air from the room. "Miss Sarah Miller?" the man asked. His voice was deep and authoritative, the kind that expected answers, not questions. Sarah nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The coffee pot felt unnaturally heavy in her hand. "My name is Jack Thompson. I'm the head counsel for Harrison Industries. Mr. James Harrison was my client." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "I need you to come with us immediately." Sarah blinked, trying to process his words. James Harrison, the quiet old man at table 4. The man who had been coming in every morning at precisely 7:15 for the past year. The man who never spoke but whose eyes held an ocean of unspoken thoughts. The man who hadn't shown up this morning. "Mr. Harrison," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he okay?" A flicker of genuine emotion passed across Jack Thompson's face. "Mr. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep last night." The coffee pot grew impossibly heavier in Sarah's hand. She felt Dorothy, the senior waitress, move closer behind her, curiosity and suspicion radiating from her presence. "I am sorry to hear that," Sarah said softly, a wave of unexpected grief washing over her. It was strange to feel such loss for a man who had never even spoken to her. "Mr. Harrison left very specific instructions regarding his final will and testament," Thompson continued. "Your presence is required at the reading. If you could gather your things, a car is waiting outside." Frank emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. At 68, the former Navy man still carried himself with military bearing, despite the slight stoop in his shoulders and the limp from his bad knee. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his Boston accent thick with suspicion. Thompson turned to him. "Are you the proprietor of this establishment?" 30 years running, Frank said, proudly, chest puffing slightly. "Then you should know that Miss Miller's presence is requested regarding legal matters. She will need to be excused from her duties." Frank looked from Thompson to Sarah, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Sarah, what's this about?" Sarah stood speechless, the coffee pot still in her hand, her mind racing. Why would a customer include her in his will? She had only cut his toast into 4 neat squares each morning, nothing more. "I have no idea," she finally managed, turning to Frank with pleading eyes. "Can I?" Frank waved his hand. Go. Dorothy can cover your tables." He cast a suspicious glance at the men in suits. "But you call if there's any trouble, you hear." Dorothy snatched the coffee pot from Sarah's hand. "Well, isn't this interesting?" she muttered, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Always knew there was something going on with you and the old man at 4. Sarah ignored the comment and hurried to the break room to grab her purse and jacket. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. James Harrison. She'd known him only as Mr. H, until one day she had glimpsed his name on a credit card. He was just the quiet old man who liked his toast cut into squares, because his hands trembled too much to manage it himself. What could he possibly want with her now that he was gone? When she emerged from the break room, Thompson and his men formed a protective circle around her, creating a bizarre bubble of wealth and power in the humble diner as they escorted her out the door. Outside, a sleek black Lincoln Continental waited at the curb, its engine a quiet purr. One of the men opened the door for her as Sarah slid onto the plush leather seat, more luxurious than any piece of furniture she owned. She looked back at Blue Horizon Diner. Under the gray October sky, it looked small and when the neon sign flickering slightly, as it always did after 10 years of Frank promising to fix it. She had a terrifying feeling that she would never see it the same way again. The ride into downtown Boston was surreal. Sarah had lived her entire 24 years in the working-class suburb of Millfield, rarely venturing into the city except for occasional museum visits when she could afford the time and fare. Now she was gliding through the streets in a luxury car, surrounded by men in suits who looked like they stepped out of a spy movie. Jack Thompson sat opposite her, reviewing documents from his briefcase. His face was impassive, giving away nothing. The silence in the car was thick and uncomfortable. "I don't understand," Sarah finally said, unable to bear the silence any longer. "I just served him coffee. I barely knew Mr. Harrison." Thompson looked up from his papers, studying her with intelligent eyes. Mr. Harrison was a very observant man. He noticed things others missed. Like what? Like kindness freely given with no expectation of reward. Thompson returned to his papers, clearly ending the conversation. Sarah turned to look out the window, watching as the modest buildings of her neighborhood gave way to the gleaming skyscrapers of downtown Boston. The car eventually pulled up to a towering glass building that seemed to touch the clouds. Harrison Industries was emblazoned in elegant letters across the entrance. Inside the lobby was a cathedral to corporate success. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, and a security desk that looked like it belonged in Fort Knox. Sarah was acutely aware of her waitress uniform, the small coffee stain on her sleeve, and her scuffed shoes as Thompson led her to a private elevator. The elevator whispered upward to the 50th floor. When the doors opened, they revealed a reception area larger than her entire apartment. A sleek-looking woman behind the desk barely glanced at Sarah, her eyes showing a flicker of curiosity before her professional mask returned. "They're waiting in the main conference room, Mr. Thompson," she said. Sarah was led down a hallway lined with original artwork and into a vast boardroom dominated by a long, polished mahogany table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor that momentarily took her breath away. At the far end of the table sat two people who radiated an aura of privilege that made Sarah instantly uncomfortable. The woman was in her early 60s, elegantly dressed in a navy suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a perfect chignon. Her face was a mask of polite indifference. Beside her sat a younger man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair styled with expensive precision, wearing a designer suit that looked like it cost more than Sarah's annual rent. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the table, not bothering to hide his annoyance. Thompson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Victoria Harrison, Mr. Michael Harrison, may I present Miss Sarah Miller?" Michael Harrison's eyes swept over Sarah in a single dismissive glance. "This is who we've been waiting for." A waitress grandfather really did lose his mind in the end. "Michael, please," Victoria chided, though there was no real warmth in her tone. Her gaze on Sarah was calculating, assessing. "Miss Miller, please have a seat," Thompson said, gesturing to a chair far down the table from the Harrisons. Sarah sat her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The bodyguards positioned themselves against the wall, silent sentinels. "Now that all parties mentioned in the primary codicil are present, we can proceed with the reading of James Harrison's last will and testament," Thompson announced, opening a thick leather-bound document. He began to read in a formal monotone. Most of it was legal jargon that flew right over Sarah's head. Trust endowments to charities she'd never heard of, bequests to foundations. The sums being discussed were staggering numbers that felt more like concepts than actual money. The Harrison fortune was clearly immense. Then Thompson paused and looked directly at Victoria and Michael. "To my daughter-in-law, Victoria Harrison, and my grandson, Michael Harrison, I leave the contents of the Harrison Family Trust as contractually obligated by pre-existing family arrangements. This amounts to a principal sum of $10 million each." Michael scoffed loudly. "10 million? That's it. The company is worth billions." Your grandfather liquidated the majority of his personal assets over the last 2 years, Thompson said coolly. What he did with his personal fortune was and remains his own prerogative. He owed it to us. We're his family. Victoria snapped, her composure cracking slightly. Thompson ignored them and continued reading. All remaining personal effects properties and the controlling interest in Harrison Industries are to be dealt with as follows. He turned a page. Sarah held her breath, still not understanding why she was even there. Perhaps Mr. Harrison had left her a small token, a few $100s as a final silent tip. That would be more than enough a kind gesture from a quiet man. And now, Thompson said, looking over his glasses directly at Sarah, his voice resonating in the silent room. We come to the final provision. He read from the will to Miss Sarah Miller, the young woman at the Blue Horizon Diner, who showed an old man kindness when she had no reason to, who treated me with dignity when others saw only a nuisance, and who without fail cut my toast because she noticed my hands trembled. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He had noticed everything. Thompson continued, to Miss Miller, I leave a legacy of kindness returned. First, I bequeath to her the sum of $250,000 to be transferred to her account immediately to ease her burdens as she once eased mine. Sarah gasped. The room tilted slightly. $250,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined holding. It would pay for her mother's care for years. It would clear her student loans. It was a miracle. What? Michael exploded, leaping to his feet. He's giving $250,000 to a hash slinger. We'll contest this. He was clearly not of sound mind. Please sit down, Mr. Harrison, Thompson said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. I am not finished. Michael stared, then slowly sank back into his chair, his face flushed with rage. Thompson adjusted his glasses and read the final sentence. And finally, because it was the last place on earth where I felt seen not as a source of wealth, but as a human being, I leave her the one thing that brought me a small measure of peace in my final years. I bequeath to Miss Sarah Miller in its entirety the property and business known as the Blue Horizon Diner, located at 152 Maple Street, which I purchased 6 months ago through a subsidiary company. Silence. A thick, profound silence filled the boardroom. Sarah just stared, her mind unable to process the words. The diner. He bought the diner for her. Then Michael started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was sharp, ugly, incredulous. The diner. He leaves her a greasy spoon. Oh, that's rich. After all that build-up, he leaves the waitress her own cage. But Thompson wasn't smiling. He closed the will, removed his glasses, and looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of respect and warning. There is one more thing, Miss Miller, he said, his voice low. Included with the diner is a small investment portfolio Mr. Harrison attached to the business to ensure its long-term viability and provide for capital improvements. It is currently valued at approximately $5 million. The laughter died in Michael's throat. His face went from red to a sickly, pale white. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. $5 million, the diner. It wasn't a cage, it was a kingdom. The grumpy, silent old man she had served coffee to the man she felt sorry for wasn't just wealthy. He was James Harrison, founder of Harrison Industries, a corporate titan who had hidden in plain sight. And he had just handed her, a broke art student, slinging hash in a greasy spoon, the keys to a new life. Leaving the law offices was like stepping out of a dream and into a storm. The bodyguards escorted Sarah back to the Lincoln Continental, shielding her from Michael's furious, sputtering insults as he followed them into the hallway. This isn't over, you little gold digger, he seethed, his face contorted with rage. I'll have my lawyers crawl over every inch of this. You won't see a dime. Sarah didn't respond. She was still in a state of profound shock, her mind numbly replaying Thompson's words. $5 million. The diner is yours. Thompson had given her his card and a thick folder of documents before she left. A financial advisor will call you tomorrow, Miss Miller. Do not speak to anyone, especially the Harrisons. If they contact you, call me immediately. James anticipated their reaction. The car dropped her off in front of her rundown apartment building. The contrast was jarring. One moment she was in a world of mahogany and billions. The next she was climbing the creaky, dusty stairs to her tiny one-bedroom apartment. She unlocked the door and stepped inside the folder clutched to her chest like a life raft. The apartment was small but clean, with second-hand furniture and walls adorned with her own paintings. Canvases were stacked against one wall, her easel standing empty in the corner, a silent testament to dreams deferred. Sarah had been forced to drop out of art school in her final year when her mother was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. With no other family to help and medical bills mounting, she had put her dreams on hold. The Blue Horizon Diner had been her lifeline, Frank giving her flexible hours so she could visit her mother at the care facility whenever possible. The first thing Sarah did was call her mother's care facility. With a trembling voice, she spoke to the financial administrator and paid the entire outstanding balance, then paid for the next 2 years in advance, requesting a private room and the best possible care. The relief that washed over her was so immense it brought her to her knees. She sat on her floor and wept not from sadness, but from the sudden crushing release of a burden she had carried for so long. Once the tears subsided, she began to examine the folder Thompson had given her. It contained legal documents confirming her ownership of the diner, details of the investment portfolio, and contact information for various financial advisors and attorneys. At the bottom of the pile was a small, cream-colored envelope with her name written on it in a shaky hand. Inside was a brass key and a handwritten note. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then the world knows my secret and you have received my gift. The money is for your freedom. The diner is for your heart. This key opens my private study at my penthouse. Jack knows where. Go there when you're ready to understand why. An old man's final request. J.H." Sarah stared at the key, turning it over in her hands. It was old-fashioned heavy brass with an intricate design on the bow. What secrets did James Harrison want her to discover? The next morning, Sarah didn't go to the diner. She couldn't face Frank, yet couldn't explain what had happened. Instead, she went to the bank with a cashier's check for $250,000 that Thompson had prepared for her. The bank manager, who usually treated her with polite indifference when she came in to cash her meager paychecks, ushered her into his private office with newfound sycophantic respect. The world had already begun to shift around her. By afternoon, Sarah knew she couldn't hide forever. Taking a deep breath, she walked the familiar blocks to the Blue Horizon Diner. It was the middle of the lunch rush. Through the window, she could see Dorothy looking harassed and Frank sweating over the grill. She pushed open the door. The little bell chimed. Every head turned. Conversation stopped. Frank looked up from the grill, spatula in hand. Dorothy, holding a tray of burgers, froze mid-stride. News traveled fast in Millfield. "Sarah," Frank said, his voice uncertain. "Hi, Frank," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She walked up to the counter. "I guess you've heard." "Heard you came into some money," Dorothy said, setting her tray down with a thud. There was a sharp, envious edge to her voice. "Decided you're too good to show up for your shift, huh?" "Dorothy," Frank warned. "No, it's okay," Sarah said. She looked from Frank to Dorothy, then to the other staff peeking out from the kitchen. These people had been her world for 3 years. "It's true, James, Mr. Harrison, he left me some money." She took a deep breath. "And he left me the diner." A collective gasp went through the staff. Frank's spatula clattered onto the grill. "He what?" Frank sputtered. "I own this diner. I've owned it for 30 years. Sarah's heart sank. This was the part Thompson had warned her about. She opened the folder and pulled out a document. "According to this, Frank, you sold the diner 6 months ago to a company called J.H. Holdings. You've been operating as a salaried manager since then." Frank stared, his face turning ashen. "J.H. Holdings, they offered me a fortune, more than this place was worth. I thought it was some big real estate developer who was going to tear it down." He sank onto a stool, looking utterly defeated. "So I've been working for the old man all this time, and now I work for you." The absurdity of the situation hit everyone at once. Sarah Miller, the quiet waitress, who was constantly getting her hours cut, was now their boss. Dorothy let out a short, bitter laugh. "Well, isn't this a fairy tale? So what now, boss? Going to fire us all and hire your friends?" The challenge hung in the air. This was her first test. Every eye was on her. She could feel the resentment, the disbelief, the fear. Her old life was gone. She was no longer one of them. She was the owner, the other. Sarah took a deep breath, pushing aside her own shock and fear. She thought of James, of his quiet dignity. What would he have wanted? No one is getting fired, she said, her voice clear and firm, surprising even herself. Nothing is changing right now. Frank, you're the best grill cook in the city. Dorothy, you can handle a six-table rush without breaking a sweat. This place runs because of you. I don't know the first thing about running a business. I'm going to need your help. Her honesty seemed to deflate some of the tension. Frank looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Dorothy just scowled, unconvinced. So what's your big plan? Dorothy challenged. Going to start serving champagne and caviar? No, Sarah said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. But I am going to buy a new coffee machine and fix the air conditioning. It was the right thing to say. A few of the kitchen staff chuckled. These were their daily complaints, the small miseries of their job. Hearing them acknowledged by the new owner, their former coworker, meant something. Just then the bell on the door chimed again. A messenger stood there with a package. Delivery for Sarah Miller, he said, handing her a slim, elegant box from the Sterling, Cromwell and Davies law firm. Sarah signed for it and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single old-fashioned brass key matching the one from the envelope and another handwritten note on heavy cream-colored stationery. Time to learn the truth. The car will pick you up at 7 p.m. JT. Sarah looked at the key, then at Frank and Dorothy, both watching her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her new life was unfolding at dizzying speed, but one thing was becoming clear. James Harrison hadn't just given her money and a building. He had given her a mystery to solve. And as she looked at the resentful faces of her new employees and remembered Michael Harrison's venomous threats, she realized she would need to solve it quickly if she was going to truly claim the life James Harrison had bequeathed her. The address Jack Thompson gave Sarah for James Harrison's private residence was on Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was a stately brownstone with a wrought iron fence and a dignified facade that spoke of old money and quiet power. When the now familiar Lincoln Continental pulled up at precisely 7 p.m., Sarah was waiting. She had changed from her diner uniform into the nicest outfit she owned, a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store, but she still felt woefully underdressed for wherever she was going. Thompson was waiting for her at the entrance. His expression was somber. He didn't allow anyone into his personal residence in over a decade, he explained, as they rode a silent, wood-paneled elevator to the top floor. Not even his family. He conducted all his business from his corporate headquarters. This was his sanctuary. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Sarah stepped out and forgot to breathe. It was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the Boston skyline and the Charles River beyond. But it wasn't the view or the scale of the place that stunned her. It was the art. The walls were covered with masterpieces. A Monet hung over the fireplace, its water lilies shimmering in the warm light. A Degas sculpture of a dancer sat on a pedestal. A small, intense Van Gogh self-portrait stared out from a side wall. He was one of the world's most discreet art collectors, Thompson said softly, observing her reaction. This collection is priceless. The apartment was immaculate, yet it felt profoundly lonely. There were no family photos, no clutter, just priceless art and elegant, sterile furniture. It felt like a museum, not a home. The study is this way, Thompson said, leading her down a long hall. He stopped at a heavy oak door. He gave me a sealed envelope with instructions to open it only upon his death to grant you access. I will wait for you out here. Sarah's hand trembled as she inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying click. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was completely different from the rest of the apartment. It was warm and lived in. Books crammed every shelf from classic literature to modern physics. A large worn leather armchair sat beside a fireplace. A faint scent of old paper and pipe tobacco lingered in the air. But what dominated the room was the wall behind the massive desk. It wasn't covered in art. It was a corkboard stretching from floor to ceiling, covered in a complex web of photographs, stock charts, legal documents, and handwritten notes connected by colored strings. It was the strategic map of a general commanding a global empire. This was the real James Harrison. At the very center of this web, however, was something that didn't fit. It was a small, slightly blurry photograph. Sarah stepped closer. It was a picture of a woman laughing sitting on a checkered blanket in a park. She was beautiful with kind eyes and a warm smile. Next to it was another photo, this one of the same woman standing proudly in front of a small, charming storefront. The sign above the door read, Eleanor's Table. Sarah's eyes were then drawn to a series of newspaper clippings yellowed with age. The headlines told a tragic story. Promising restaurateur Eleanor Harrison dies in car accident. Corporate raider Thomas Vance acquires bankrupt restaurant chain. Harrison Industries announces hostile takeover of Vance Industries. It all started to click into place. Eleanor must have been his wife. She was a restaurateur, a creator of simple places for people to eat. She had been killed, and a corporate predator named Vance had seemingly profited from her death only to be crushed years later by a vengeful James. Drawn by a name, she looked at a different section of the board. It was dedicated to Michael. There were photos of him on yachts and nightclubs with a string of models. There were financial reports showing massive losses from tech startups he'd founded with his grandfather's money. There were copies of checks James had written to pay off Michael's gambling debts. One note in James's shaky hand read, "He has her name but none of her heart." Finally, her eyes found a small empty space on the board. Tacked to it was a single recent photo. It was a candid shot taken from a distance of Sarah herself. She was outside the Blue Horizon diner on her break, smiling at something on her phone. Pinned next to it was a small handwritten note. "She has her heart." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. It was never about the toast, not really. He wasn't testing her kindness. He was looking for a reflection of his lost wife, Eleanor. He was searching for someone with a good heart, someone who understood that the value of a place wasn't in its price tag but in the warmth and dignity it offered. The diner wasn't just any diner. It reminded him of his wife's dream. In leaving it to Sarah, he wasn't just giving her a gift. He was entrusting her with Eleanor's legacy. Suddenly, a new determination hardened through her grief. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring the faith of a lonely old man who had lost everything that truly mattered to him. Michael didn't just want the money. He wanted to destroy the last thing his grandfather had built, the one thing James believed was a worthy legacy. She walked over to the desk. On it was a single sealed envelope addressed to her. She opened it. Inside was a letter and a stock certificate for a single share of Harrison Industries. The letter read, "Sarah, knowledge is power. This single share gives you the legal right to attend the annual shareholder meeting next month. Michael will be there. He will try to seize control of the board. He thinks you are a nobody. Prove him wrong. Everything you need is in this room. Your friend James." Sarah looked around the study at the web of power, at the story of love, loss, and revenge. It was a complete dossier on the Harrison Empire and its enemies. James hadn't just given her a diner and a fortune. He had given her an arsenal. The war with Michael Harrison was coming, and James had just armed his most unlikely soldier for the fight of her life. The following weeks were a blur of transformation for Sarah Miller. She spent her days at the Blue Horizon diner and her nights in James Harrison's study. Jack Thompson had arranged for her to have unlimited discreet access to the penthouse. The bodyguards now on her payroll would drive her there after her shift at the diner. At first, her presence at Blue Horizon was awkward. She tried to fall back into her old role, refilling coffees and taking orders, but Frank wouldn't let her. "You're the owner now, Sarah," Frank said gently, taking a coffee pot from her hand one afternoon. "You should be in the office looking at the books. Let us handle this." He was right. She retreated to the tiny, cluttered back office and began to learn. With the help of the financial advisor Thompson had arranged, she started to understand profit margins, supply chains, and payroll. The $5 million portfolio wasn't just a lump sum. It was a carefully managed fund designed to generate steady income, more than enough to cover the diner's expenses and provide a handsome salary for her. The morning after receiving her inheritance, Sarah's first call had been to Pinecrest Care Facility. The relief in her voice was palpable as she spoke to the administrator. "I'd like to pay my mother's outstanding balance in full," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'd like to upgrade her to a private room with a comprehensive care package for the next 2 years. The administrator, who had previously been coldly professional when discussing payment plans, suddenly became warm and accommodating. "Of course, Ms. Miller. That would be wonderful for Mrs. Miller. She's one of our favorite residents." Sarah nearly laughed at the sudden change in tone. It was amazing what money could do. That afternoon, she visited her mother. Catherine Miller had once been vibrant and strong, the kind of woman who painted murals on weekends and taught art to underprivileged children. Now at 58, cancer had whittled her down to a shadow, but her eyes still lit up when Sarah walked into the room. "There's my girl," Catherine said, her voice thin but warm. Sarah sat beside her, taking her frail hand. "I have news, Mom. Good news." As Sarah explained what had happened, leaving out some of the more complex details, her mother's eyes widened. When she finished, Catherine was silent for a long moment. "This James Harrison," she finally said, "he recognized something special in you, something I've always seen." She squeezed Sarah's hand. "You've always had a gift for seeing people, Sarah. Really seeing them." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I just cut his toast." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You saw his dignity when others saw only his age. That's rare, sweetheart. Rarer than money." Back at the diner, Dorothy was proving to be Sarah's harshest critic. She watched Sarah with narrowed eyes as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. The turning point came one sweltering afternoon in late October when the ancient air conditioner finally died with a groan and a puff of smoke. The kitchen became an inferno. "That's it. I quit," Dorothy announced, throwing her apron down. "I'm not working in a sauna." The old Sarah would have pleaded with her to stay. The new Sarah nodded. "You're right," she said calmly. "It's unacceptable." She got on the phone. Within 2 hours, a team of technicians was there installing a brand new top-of-the-line commercial air conditioning system. She paid for the emergency installation without blinking. The next day, the diner was cool and comfortable. Dorothy came back to work and didn't say a word about her threat to quit, but she started calling Sarah boss. And for the first time, it didn't sound like an insult. Sarah had earned a sliver of respect, not with words, but with action. Her nights were spent in a different world. In James's study, she became a student of power. With Jack Thompson as her reluctant tutor, she began to unravel the complex web on the corkboard. She learned about shell corporations, leveraged buyouts, and proxy battles. She read James's private journals filled with his observations on business life and his profound, unending grief for Eleanor. "You need to understand what you're up against," Thompson told her one evening, pointing to a photo of Michael on the board. "Michael Harrison isn't just an entitled rich kid. He's desperate." Sarah learned about Michael's recklessness, his failed ventures funded by his grandfather, and his deep-seated resentment. She discovered James's masterstroke. In his final years, he had been systematically breaking up pieces of Harrison Industries, making the core company leaner, but also more vulnerable. He had converted most of his personal fortune into a series of anonymous charitable foundations. He intentionally capped Michael's inheritance at $10 million, Thompson explained. He knew Michael would blow through it quickly with his lifestyle, then come after the company. "So he set a trap," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "Precisely. Michael thinks he's inheriting a kingdom. James left him a battlefield with a depleted army. The one thing Michael did have was the support of a few key board members who were loyal to his father and saw him as the rightful heir. His plan, as pieced together from James's notes, was clear. At the upcoming annual shareholder meeting, he would call for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, George Riley, a loyalist appointed by James, and use his family name and the support of his allies to get himself installed as chairman. "He can't win outright," Thompson explained one evening, pointing to a chart of major shareholders. "But he can cause chaos. He can spook the investors, drive the stock price down, and try to force a sale to a rival corporation who will install him as a puppet leader. His ego won't accept anything less than total control, even if it means burning the empire to the ground." "So how do we stop him?" Sarah asked, looking at the single share certificate on the desk. "It seems so insignificant." "We use the one thing James left you," Thompson said. "The truth. That single share gives you the right to be in that room and the right to speak to the shareholders. We can't outvote him, but perhaps we can outmaneuver him." Sarah spent hours studying Michael's file. There was something about him that intrigued her. Behind the arrogance and entitlement, she sensed a profound wound. One evening, she found a folder labeled Background. Inside were newspaper clippings about the death of James's son Robert and his wife Elaine, Michael's parents, in a private plane crash when Michael was just 10 years old. There were school reports showing Michael's grades plummeting after the accident, therapy assessments, incidents of acting out. A handwritten note from James read, "The boy blames me for the accident. Perhaps he's right. If I hadn't insisted Robert fly to Chicago that weekend." Sarah sat back feeling a wave of empathy for Michael despite everything. He had lost his parents at a formative age and apparently blamed his grandfather. No wonder there was such tension between them. As she dug deeper, she found more evidence of a troubled relationship. College tuition checks, stern letters about responsibility, notes about rehab stays. A pattern emerged. Michael would fail. James would bail him out, but always with strings attached, always with reminders of his shortcomings. He wanted to break the cycle, Thompson said when Sarah asked him about it. He bailed Michael out one too many times. He felt he was enabling self-destruction. So instead, he set me against him, Sarah said, troubled by the thought. Thompson shook his head. Not exactly. James didn't expect you to fight Michael. He expected you to show him another way, the way Eleanor would have. The more Sarah learned about Eleanor Harrison, the more she understood what James had seen in her. Eleanor had been a talented chef who believed food could build community. She had started with one small restaurant, Eleanor's Table, focusing on simple, delicious food served in a welcoming atmosphere. Her restaurants weren't about exclusivity or high prices. They were about bringing people together. When she died in a car accident in 1985, her small chain of restaurants was vulnerable. Thomas Vance, a corporate raider, moved in and acquired the company. He promptly stripped it of assets, closed most locations, and converted the rest into soulless franchise operations that bore no resemblance to Eleanor's vision. James Harrison had spent the next decade systematically destroying Vance, ultimately taking over his company and dismantling it piece by piece. It was a revenge served very, very cold. But the one thing James couldn't recapture was Eleanor's restaurants. That dream had died with her. Until perhaps now. Was that what he saw in the Blue Horizon Diner? A chance to resurrect Eleanor's dream through Sarah, one rainy afternoon 2 weeks after the reading of the will. Sarah was going over the diner's books when Frank knocked on the office door. "There's someone here to see you," he said, his expression concerned. "Says he's Michael Harrison." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. She hadn't seen Michael since the reading of the will. "Send him in." Michael Harrison looked different from their first meeting. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of the small office, taking in the ancient filing cabinet, the peeling linoleum, and the outdated computer. "So, this is what $5 million buys these days," he said, but the usual bite was missing from his voice. He sounded tired. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrison?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice professional. Michael sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited. "I wanted to see it for myself. The place my grandfather chose over his own flesh and blood." Sarah studied him. There was something different about him today. The arrogance was subdued, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine curiosity. "He didn't choose the diner over you," Sarah said carefully. "He left you $10 million. Michael laughed a hollow sound. $10 million is pocket change for a man who was worth billions. It's an insult. "Maybe it's all he trusted you with," Sarah said before she could stop herself. She expected anger, but Michael just nodded slowly. "You've been talking to Jack, learning all about poor, pathetic Michael, who can't be trusted with his inheritance." He looked around the office again. "But he trusted you, a complete stranger, with this place. Why?" The question seemed genuine. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I don't think it was about trust exactly. I think it was about understanding what this place meant. To him, it wasn't just a business. It was a connection to my grandmother," Michael finished for her. "Eleanor and her restaurants. I know the story." Sarah was surprised. "You do?" "Of course I do. It was the great family legend. How they met when she was a waitress. How she had a dream of creating restaurants where people felt at home. How much they loved each other." His voice turned bitter. How devastated he was when she died. So devastated that he threw himself into revenge and business and never had time for his son. Or his grandson. Sarah was silent, absorbing this new perspective. "Did you know he missed my college graduation because he was closing a deal to acquire the last piece of Vance Industries?" Michael continued. 15 years after my grandmother died, and he was still obsessed with revenge. That was the kind of man James Harrison really was. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "That must have been painful." Michael looked startled by her empathy. He recovered quickly. Ancient history now. He stood up, straightening his jacket. The shareholder meeting is in 2 weeks. I assume Jack has told you all about it? He has. And I assume you'll be there playing your part in whatever game my grandfather set up. Sarah met his gaze. It's not a game to me, Mr. Harrison. This diner, these people, they matter to me. I'll do whatever it takes to protect them. Noble, Michael said, but without his usual sarcasm. I'll see you at the meeting then. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing, Ms. Miller. I'm curious. What exactly did you do to earn his trust? What was your secret? Sarah thought about it for a moment. I cut his toast into squares because his hands shook. That's all. I just saw that he needed help and gave it without being asked. Michael stared at her for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his face. Then he nodded and left without another word. Frank poked his head in a few minutes later. Everything okay, boss? That guy looked like trouble. I'm not sure, Sarah said truthfully, but I think we just had our first real conversation. That evening, Sarah met with Dr. William Freeman, James Harrison's personal physician and oldest friend. Jack Thompson had arranged the meeting at a quiet restaurant near Boston Common. Dr. Freeman was in his 70s, with a full head of white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been James's doctor for over 30 years and knew him better than almost anyone. I was surprised when Jack called, Freeman said as they settled at their table. James rarely discussed his personal affairs with me. Medicine was my domain, business was his. But he did mention you a few times in our last sessions. Sarah was startled. He talked about me, Freeman smiled. He said there was a young woman at the diner who reminded him of Eleanor. Not in looks, but in spirit. He said you had her kindness. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. I barely knew him. But you saw him, Freeman said. That was what mattered to James in the end. Being seen as a person, not as a fortune or a legend. Dr. Freeman, can I ask you something? Why did James set this up, this conflict between Michael and me? It seems cruel. Freeman considered the question carefully. James was a complex man. After Eleanor died, something hardened in him. He became ruthless in business, single-minded in his pursuit of revenge against Vance. But there was always this emptiness, this wound that never healed. He took a sip of his water. With Michael, I think James recognized that he had failed. Failed to be the grandfather Michael needed after his parents died. By the time James realized his mistake, it was too late. Michael was already on a destructive path. So this is what, a lesson, a test. I think, Freeman said slowly, it's his last attempt to save both of you. Michael from himself and you from the life of struggle he saw you living. James always believed in elegant solutions. Putting us against each other isn't very elegant, Sarah said. Unless the solution isn't about winning but about finding common ground. Freeman leaned forward. James knew he was dying for months. He had time to plan. Nothing he did was without purpose. As Sarah drove back to her apartment that night, her mind was churning with new perspectives. What if this wasn't about defeating Michael at all? What if James had a different endgame in mind? Next morning, Sarah arrived at the diner early. She had been avoiding the breakfast shift because that was when James had always come in, and his absence was still painful. But today she felt drawn to the early hours, to the rhythm of the diner coming to life. Frank was already there prepping the grill. He looked surprised to see her. Early bird today, huh? Thought I'd help with the breakfast rush, Sarah said, tying on her apron. It felt good to do something familiar, something simple. The morning progressed as it always had. The regulars trickled in, coffee was poured, orders taken. Sarah found herself glancing at table 4 every few minutes, half expecting to see James sitting there with his newspaper. Around 9, the bell over the door chimed, and Victoria Harrison walked in. The diner went quiet. Victoria looked as out of place in the blue horizon as a peacock in a chicken coop. She was impeccably dressed in a cashmere coat, her silver-streaked hair perfectly styled. She stood in the entrance, surveying the place with a critical eye. Sarah approached her, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Harrison, this is a surprise. Victoria's gaze settled on her. Miss Miller, I was hoping we could talk. Sarah led her to a booth in the back, away from curious ears. Dorothy watched them with undisguised interest as she delivered plates to a nearby table. Coffee, Sarah offered. Tea if you have it, Victoria said, removing her gloves. Sarah nodded to Dorothy, who reluctantly went to prepare the tea. This is quite a quaint establishment, Victoria said, looking around. I can see why James was drawn to it. It has a certain nostalgic charm. Sarah wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. What can I do for you, Mrs. Harrison? Victoria waited until Dorothy had delivered her tea and moved away before speaking. I wanted to talk to you about Michael. What about him? He came to see you yesterday. He was different when he came home. Thoughtful. It's not a state I often see him in. Victoria stirred her tea carefully. What did you say to him? Sarah considered her answer. We talked about James, about Eleanor, about why this place might have mattered to your father-in-law. Victoria nodded slowly. Eleanor's ghost has haunted this family for decades. James never recovered from her death. He poured all his grief into building his empire and destroying Vance. Her expression softened slightly. My husband Robert suffered for it. James was so consumed by his work that he neglected his own son. Then after Robert and Elaine died, history repeated itself with Michael. Sarah listened, fascinated by this glimpse into the Harrison family dynamics. Michael was only 10 when the accident happened, Victoria continued. James took custody, but he didn't know how to be a parent. He threw money at the problem, sent Michael to the best schools, but he was never truly present. That must have been very hard for Michael, Sarah said. Victoria looked at her sharply. Don't mistake me, Miss Miller. I'm not here to make excuses for my son. Michael has made his own choices, many of them poor ones, but I want you to understand the context. Why are you telling me this? Victoria set down her teacup. Because I believe James saw something in you that he thought could help Michael. Not just financially, but personally. And after speaking with you, I can see why. Sarah was taken aback. I don't understand. You listen, Miss Miller. You truly listen. It's a rare quality. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. This is for you. James gave it to me years ago with instructions to deliver it if certain events came to pass. I believe now is the time. Sarah took the envelope, feeling the weight of yet another piece of James's puzzle. Whatever game James was playing, Victoria said, rising to leave, I hope it ends with both you and Michael intact. This family has seen enough destruction. After Victoria left, Sarah retreated to her office and opened the envelope. Inside was a key card with the Harrison Industries logo and a small note in James's handwriting, the executive floor, the cabinet behind my desk, the final piece of my team. That evening, Sarah used the key card to access the executive floor of Harrison Industries. The office was empty, the staff having gone home hours ago. James's corner office was exactly as he had left it, a time capsule of power and precision. Behind his desk was an antique cabinet. Using the brass key from the first envelope, Sarah opened it to find a single leather-bound journal and a USB drive. The journal contained James's most private thoughts about Michael, about his regrets as a grandfather, and about his hopes for Harrison Industries after his death. The final entry, dated just a week before he passed, read, I have set the stage for my final act. Sarah Miller carries Eleanor's spirit without knowing it. Michael carries my drive, but has lost his way. Together they might salvage what remains of this family's soul. The company is secondary. It always was, though it took me a lifetime to realize it. Eleanor knew. She always knew what mattered. The USB drive contained a comprehensive plan for transforming Harrison Industries. Not selling it, not breaking it up, but refocusing it on community investment and sustainable business practices. It was a vision that combined James's business acumen with Eleanor's heart, and it required both Sarah and Michael to implement it. As Sarah sat in James's chair, surrounded by the trappings of power he had accumulated over decades, she finally understood what he had been trying to do. This wasn't about choosing her over Michael. It was about bringing them together to create something neither could build alone. The shareholder meeting was 5 days away. Sarah had much to learn and little time. But for the first time since this strange journey began, she felt like she understood the map James had left for her. The next morning, Sarah called an emergency staff meeting at the diner before opening. Frank, Dorothy, and the rest of the employees gathered in the dining area, curious and a little worried. I want to talk to you all about the future of Blue Horizon, Sarah began. When James Harrison left this place to me, I think he was doing more than just giving me a business. He was entrusting me with a legacy. And she told them about Eleanor Harrison and her vision for restaurants as community spaces. She explained how James had seen the Blue Horizon as a place that could carry that vision forward. I want to renovate the diner, she announced, not to make it fancy or exclusive, but to honor its history while making it better. New equipment for the kitchen, repairs to the building, maybe expanded hours and a few new menu items, but keeping the heart of what makes this place special. She looked at her staff, these people who had been her colleagues and were now her employees. I can't do this without you. I need your expertise, your experience, and your commitment. In return, I'm offering raises for everyone and health insurance benefits. There was a stunned silence, then a burst of excited conversation. Health insurance, Dorothy asked, her usual cynicism faltering. Real health insurance. Full coverage, Sarah confirmed, and a 401k plan. Frank whistled low. That's not small potatoes, Sarah. You sure the business can handle that? James set up the investment fund to support exactly these kinds of improvements, Sarah said. He wanted this place to thrive, not just survive, and he wanted the people who make it special to thrive too. Later that day, contractors arrived to begin assessing the building for renovations. Sarah had retained a small local architecture firm that specialized in preserving historic businesses while modernizing their infrastructure. As she watched them take measurements and make notes, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Dorothy. Got a minute, boss? Dorothy asked, her usual edge softened slightly. They sat at the counter, coffee cups in hand. I've been working here for 12 years, Dorothy began. Seen owners come and go. Frank's been the only constant. Sarah nodded, listening. When you came in as a waitress 3 years ago, I didn't think you'd last a month. Too soft, too artsy. Dorothy looked down at her coffee. But you surprised me. You worked hard, never complained, and you noticed things others missed. Like Mr. Harrison's toast, Sarah said softly. Like his toast, Dorothy agreed. Like my arthritis acting up on rainy days, when you quietly took my heavy trays without making a big deal of it. Like remembering every regular's order after hearing it once. Sarah was surprised. She hadn't realized Dorothy had noticed these small gestures. What I'm trying to say is, Dorothy continued, clearly uncomfortable with the sentiment. Maybe the old man knew what he was doing when he picked you, and maybe we're lucky he did. It wasn't quite an apology for her earlier hostility, but from Dorothy it was practically a declaration of loyalty. Sarah smiled, touched by the unexpected support. Thank you, Dorothy. That means a lot. Dorothy nodded brusquely, then slid off her stool. Well, back to work. These tables won't serve themselves. As Dorothy walked away, Sarah felt a new sense of confidence. She was gaining allies one person at a time. James had been right to believe in the power of small kindnesses. They were the foundation upon which everything else would be built. That night, Sarah returned to James's study to prepare for the shareholder meeting. She spread the documents across his desk, reviewing balance sheets, quarterly reports, and the files on key board members. The more she learned, the more daunting the task seemed. She was an art student turned waitress, preparing to address some of the most powerful business leaders in Boston. Jack Thompson found her there, surrounded by papers, her hair tied back in a messy bun, a pencil stuck behind her ear. You look like James before a big deal, he commented, setting down his briefcase. Sarah looked up bleary-eyed. I don't know if I can do this, Jack. These people are going to laugh me out of the room. Thompson sat across from her. They might try, but James wouldn't have put you in this position if he didn't believe you could handle it. Why me? Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. Out of all the people in the world, why choose someone with no business experience, no connections, nothing to offer but the ability to cut toast into squares? Thompson considered his answer carefully. James spent the last 40 years of his life building an empire. He became one of the richest, most powerful men in the country. And in the end, did you know what he valued most? The simple human connection he found at a worn-out booth in a diner. He gestured to the wall of information James had compiled. All of this, the wealth, the power, the revenge, it didn't fill the hole Eleanor's death left. But your small act of kindness, your ability to see the human being behind the wealth that touched something in him that had been dormant for decades. Sarah absorbed his words, feeling their weight. So what do I do now? How do I honor that? By remembering what matters, Thompson said simply. The money, the business, they're just tools. What matters is what you do with them. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. I've prepared a statement for you to read at the meeting. It's professionally written, covers all the key points, and should satisfy the shareholders. Sarah took the folder and opened it. The statement was perfect. Polished, corporate, safe. Exactly what would be expected. Thank you, she said. But I think I need to find my own words. James didn't choose me for my ability to read a prepared statement. Thompson smiled slightly. I had a feeling you'd say that. But the offer stands if you change your mind. As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. Jack, do you think there's any chance of reaching Michael, of finding common ground? Thompson paused. James seemed to think so. Otherwise, why set this all up? He shrugged. Stranger things have happened than two people finding a way past their differences. Left alone in the study, Sarah turned to the corkboard wall again. Her eyes found the photo of Eleanor standing proudly in front of her first restaurant. There was such joy in her face, such purpose and pride. Next to it was the photo of Sarah herself, unaware she was being photographed, smiling in the sunlight outside the diner. I hope you knew what you were doing, James, she whispered to the empty room, because in 5 days I'm either going to save your legacy or destroy it completely. The morning of the Harrison Industries shareholder meeting arrived with a clarity that comes only in autumn. The Boston sky was a crisp, brilliant blue, the air cool and sharp with possibility. Sarah Miller stood in front of the full-length mirror in her new apartment, barely recognizing herself. Gone was the waitress uniform, the practical jeans and sneakers. In their place was a tailored navy suit, understated but impeccably cut. Jack Thompson had insisted on a professional wardrobe, sending her to the kind of boutique where prices weren't displayed and salespeople spoke in hushed tones. You look the part, she told her reflection, trying to quiet the voice in mind that whispered she was an imposter. The last 5 days had been a whirlwind of preparation. She had studied financial reports until her eyes burned, practiced her speech until the words became part of her, and tried to anticipate every possible scenario that might unfold in that boardroom. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her security team, a discreet but constant presence since the reading of the will. The car is ready, Miss Miller. Sarah took one last look in the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. Time to finish what James started. The Harrison Industries tower gleamed in the morning sun, its glass facade reflecting the city around it. As the car pulled into the underground parking garage, Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. This was James Harrison's world, not hers. Yet here she was about to step into an arena where millions of dollars hung in the balance. Jack Thompson was waiting for her at the private elevator, his expression unreadable as always. Ready? He asked simply. Sarah nodded, though ready was the last thing she felt. As they rode up to the conference level, Thompson briefed her one last time. Michael arrived early. He's already meeting with board members. Victoria is here as well, which is unusual. She rarely attends these meetings. Is that good or bad for us? I'm not sure, Thompson admitted. Victoria plays her cards close to her chest, always has. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area where shareholders and executives mingled, coffee cups in hand, conversations dropping to whispers as Sarah entered. She felt the weight of their stares, their curiosity, their judgment. George Riley, the current CEO of Harrison Industries, approached them immediately. He was in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of a man who had been in charge for a long time. Jack, he greeted Thompson, then turned to Sarah with undisguised interest. And you must be Ms. Miller. I've heard a great deal about you. All good things, I hope, Sarah said, extending her hand. Riley shook it firmly. James Harrison didn't give his trust easily. The fact that he entrusted you with anything at all says a great deal about your character. Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Quite the spectacle, isn't it? The waitress comes to Wall Street. Michael Harrison stood a few feet away, immaculate in a charcoal suit, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand despite the early hour. But there was something different about him today. The hostility in his eyes seemed forced and almost as if he was playing a role he no longer fully believed in. Good morning, Michael, Sarah said calmly. I hope you have had time to review the proposal I sent over. 2 days ago, after much deliberation, Sarah had sent Michael the USB drive containing James's vision for Harrison Industries, along with a letter of her own. It had been a gamble showing her hand before the meeting, but she had felt it was necessary. Michael's expression flickered with surprise. I reviewed it, ambitious but impractical. The board will never go for it. Perhaps, Sarah said, or perhaps they'll see the same potential James did. A chime sounded signaling the start of the meeting. Shareholders began moving toward the main conference room, a vast space dominated by a horseshoe-shaped table. Board members and major shareholders took seats at the table, while smaller investors and observers sat in rows of chairs behind them. Sarah was led to a seat in the front row of the observer section. From here, she could see the entire board. Michael took his place at the table, a legacy seat reserved for the Harrison family. Victoria sat nearby, elegant and inscrutable as ever. The meeting began with the usual formalities: financial reports, quarterly projections, votes on routine matters. Sarah listened intently, absorbing every detail, watching the dynamics at play. Michael was charming the board members seated near him, leaning in to whisper comments that made them smile or nod in agreement. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. We now move to new business, the chairman announced. Mr. Michael Harrison has the floor. Michael rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he moved to the podium. He exuded confidence, the birthright of the privileged. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, fellow shareholders. He began, his voice strong and clear. Harrison Industries stands at a crossroads. For 40 years, my grandfather built this company with vision and determination. He created an empire that has weathered recessions, market shifts, and global challenges. He paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of key board members. But times change, markets evolve, and companies must adapt or be left behind. Michael outlined his vision for Harrison Industries, painting a picture of aggressive expansion, strategic acquisitions, and increased short-term returns for shareholders. It was a vision focused on growth at all costs, on numbers rather than people. It was everything Eleanor Harrison would have opposed. The current management has been too cautious, too traditional, Michael continued. We need bold leadership that isn't afraid to take risks, leadership that understands the modern business landscape. He formally made his motion a vote of no confidence in the current CEO and his own nomination as chairman of the board. Several of his allies quickly seconded the motion. The chairman looked around the room. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on this motion before we call the vote? This was it, the moment James had prepared her for. With a silent nod from Thompson, Sarah stood. A wave of confused whispers rippled through the audience. Who was this woman? What was she doing? The floor recognizes Ms. Sarah Miller, shareholder. The chairman announced, his voice betraying a hint of curiosity. Sarah walked to the podium, her heart thundering in her chest. The faces before her were a sea of skepticism and thinly veiled disdain. These were people who had spent lifetimes in boardrooms making deals worth millions. And she was a waitress from a diner in the suburbs. She took a deep breath and began. My name is Sarah Miller. Until 2 weeks ago, I was a waitress at the Blue Horizon Diner. I served coffee, I bussed tables, and yes, I cut toast into squares for an old man whose hands shook too much to do it himself. She paused, letting the stark contrast of her background sink in. That old man was James Harrison. For over a year, he came to the diner every morning at precisely 7:15. He sat in the same booth, ordered the same meal, and never spoke more than a few words. To most people, he was just another customer. But I saw something else in his silence. I saw a profound loneliness, a quiet dignity that touched me. The room was completely still now, all eyes fixed on her. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was the James Harrison. I simply saw a human being who deserved kindness and respect. And that, it seems, was what he had been searching for all along. Sarah turned slightly, addressing her words directly to the board members. James Harrison left me his personal papers, his private thoughts about this company and its future. He left me a glimpse into what Harrison Industries meant to him beyond the quarterly reports and stock prices. She held up the USB drive. He also left a vision. Not for a company focused solely on profit margins and market share, but a company that remembers its heart. A company that honors the legacy of the woman whose dreams started it all. Sarah told them about Eleanor Harrison, about her restaurants that brought communities together, about her belief that business could be both profitable and purposeful. Michael Harrison speaks of a bold new vision. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. But I would argue that the boldest vision isn't about acquisitions or expansions. It's about remembering why this company exists in the first place. It's about building on the foundation of integrity and community that Eleanor Harrison established and that James Harrison spent a lifetime trying to honor in his own way. She turned to look directly at Michael. This isn't about choosing between the past and the future. It's about bringing them together, creating something that honors both Eleanor's heart and James's business acumen, something that Michael's drive and vision could help build if he chose to. Sarah then revealed James's plan for Harrison Industries, a restructuring that would create a new division focused on community investment and sustainable business practices while maintaining the core operations that made the company profitable. A plan that required both innovation and tradition, both heart and mind. Therefore, as a shareholder, I propose an amendment to Michael's motion, Sarah said. Instead of a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, I propose the creation of the Eleanor Harrison Foundation to be funded by 10% of the company's annual profits dedicated to supporting small businesses and funding educational initiatives. She took a deep breath and played her final card. And I nominate Michael Harrison to lead this foundation, working alongside the current leadership to integrate these values throughout Harrison Industries. The room was silent for a long moment as the implications of her proposal sank in. She wasn't trying to defeat Michael. She was offering him a purpose, a chance to be part of his grandfather's legacy in a meaningful way, while still honoring his grandmother's values. Michael stared at her, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable. Then from her seat at the table, Victoria Harrison began to clap. Slowly at first, then with more conviction. One by one, other board members joined in until the room filled with applause. Through it all, Michael remained frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. When the applause died down, all eyes turned to him, waiting for his response. He approached the podium, gently gesturing for Sarah to step aside. She moved away, her heart racing, unsure of what was coming next. Michael looked out at the assembled shareholders, then down at the podium, gathering his thoughts. When he looked up again, something had shifted in his expression. My grandfather, he began, his voice rougher than before, was not an easy man to love. He was demanding, exacting, often absent when it mattered most. After my parents died, he became my guardian, but never really my grandfather. He provided for my material needs, but left my emotional ones largely unfilled. He paused, collecting himself. I spent most of my life trying to gain his approval, and when that failed, trying to prove I didn't need it. Neither approach brought me any peace. Michael turned to look at Sarah. When I learned about Ms. Miller's inheritance, I was furious. I saw it as a final rejection, a last insult from beyond the grave. What I failed to see was that it was also an opportunity, a chance to understand what my grandfather truly valued. He turned back to the board. I've spent the last few days reviewing James's proposal for Harrison Industries' future. At first, I dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it might be the most innovative thing this company has considered in years. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. The Eleanor Harrison Foundation isn't just a charitable endeavor, Michael continued. It's a way to reinvent our business model for a new era. An era where consumers care about corporate values as much as they care about products. Where sustainability and community investment aren't just buzzwords, but competitive advantages. He straightened his shoulders. I withdraw my motion of no confidence in the current CEO. Instead, I second Ms. Miller's proposal for the creation of the Eleanor Harrison Foundation. And I accept the nomination to lead it, provided Ms. Miller agrees to serve as co-director, bringing her unique perspective to the table. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. This was the last thing she had expected. The chairman looked as surprised as everyone else. Well, this is an unexpected development. Before we proceed to a vote, Ms. Miller, do you accept Mr. Harrison's condition? All eyes turned to Sarah. She looked at Michael, searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was something she recognized from her own mirror: uncertainty mixed with determination, fear tempered by hope. I accept, she said simply. The vote that followed was almost anticlimactic. The proposal passed unanimously, with board members falling over themselves to express support for this new direction. As the meeting moved on to other business, Sarah slipped out into the hallway, needing a moment to process what had just happened. She had expected a battle, perhaps even a defeat. Instead, she had found an ally in the most unlikely place. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Michael approaching, his expression thoughtful. "That wasn't how I expected this to go," he said, stopping a few feet away. "For either of us," Sarah agreed. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling around them. "Why did you do it?" Michael finally asked. "You could have tried to take everything, used what my grandfather gave you to push me out completely." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because that's not what James wanted. He didn't choose me over you, Michael. He chose both of us for different reasons. He saw something in me that reminded him of Eleanor. And in you, he saw himself, both the good and the bad." Michael absorbed this, his gaze distant. "I never understood him. Not really." "I don't think he understood himself until the end," Sarah said softly. "He spent 40 years building an empire to fill the hole Eleanor's death left in his life. Only in his final months did he realize it hadn't worked. That wealth and power weren't enough. And what he found meaning serving breakfast at a greasy diner." Michael's tone was skeptical but not unkind. "He found meaning in being seen as a person, not a fortune," Sarah corrected. "In simple human connection. In remembering what Eleanor had always known, that business is about people, not just profits." Michael nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "I need to show you something," he said, "if you're free after this wraps up." 2 hours later, Michael's sleek Aston Martin pulled up in front of the Blue Horizon diner. Sarah, who had followed in her car, parked beside him, curious about why he had brought her here. The lunch rush was in full swing. Through the window, she could see Dorothy expertly navigating between tables, Frank calling orders from the pass. The renovation work had begun in small ways, new lighting, fresh paint, but the heart of the place remained unchanged. "This is where it all started for my grandparents," Michael said, looking up at the building. "Not this exact diner, but one very like it. My grandmother was a waitress when they met. Did you know that?" Sarah nodded. "I found a photo in James's study. He told me the story once when I was about 12, how he was just a junior accountant eating at the same diner every day because the food was cheap and the coffee was hot. How Eleanor always remembered his order and cut his toast without being asked because she noticed his hands were always ink-stained from working on ledgers all day." Sarah felt a chill run through her, history repeating itself across generations. "She saw him," Michael continued, "not as a customer, but as a person. It was the first time anyone had really seen him. He never forgot that." They stood there for a moment, contemplating the small diner that had somehow become the nexus of their intertwined destinies. "I've been thinking," Michael said, "about the Eleanor Harrison Foundation, about what it could be. And I think we need to start right here, with this place. Turn it into a model for what we want to create elsewhere. Not just a profitable business, but a community space, something that honors both of their legacies." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her. "I think that's exactly what James had in mind." 6 months later, the Blue Horizon Diner reopened after extensive renovations. The essence of the place remained the classic 1950s aesthetic, the comfortable booths, the long counter with swivel stools, but everything had been refreshed and updated. The kitchen gleamed with new equipment. The dining area was more spacious, with a small stage in one corner for local musicians and community events. A wall of photographs chronicled the diner's history from its opening in the 1950s to the present day. Among them was a photo of James Harrison sitting at booth 4, reading his newspaper, unaware of the camera. Next to it hung a portrait of Eleanor Harrison standing proudly in front of her first restaurant. At the center of it all was booth 4 itself, preserved exactly as it had been, with a small brass plaque that read simply James's Corner. The grand reopening was a community event. Local news covered it. Neighborhood residents lined up around the block. Frank, now the official manager, beamed with pride as he showed people around. Dorothy, who had surprised everyone by revealing a talent for creating new menu items, presided over the kitchen with unprecedented good humor. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting guests, answering questions, making sure everything ran smoothly. She had found her calling not as a waitress or even as an owner, but as a steward of something larger than herself. The Eleanor Harrison Foundation was thriving under her and Michael's joint leadership. They had already provided grants to a dozen small businesses and established scholarships for 25 art students. Harrison Industries had embraced the new direction, discovering that corporate social responsibility wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Victoria Harrison had become an unexpected ally, lending her considerable social connections to the foundation's fundraising efforts. She and Sarah had developed an unlikely friendship bound by their shared connection to James and their commitment to honoring Eleanor's legacy. As the celebration continued, Sarah slipped away to the back office for a moment of quiet. On her desk sat a framed photo of her mother now in much improved health, thanks to the specialized care her new financial situation had made possible. Next to it was James Harrison's journal, a constant reminder of the responsibilities she had inherited, along with his fortune. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Michael. "Quite a success out there," he said, gesturing toward the main dining room. "Grandmother would have been proud." "I hope so," Sarah said. "I never met her, but I feel like I know her through James's writings." Michael nodded, then hesitated, clearly having something on his mind. "I've been going through some of Grandfather's personal effects at the estate. I found something I thought you should have." He handed her a small, worn leather case. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a simple pendant in the shape of a key. "It was Eleanor's," Michael explained. "James gave it to her when they opened their first restaurant together. He said it was the key to their future." Sarah looked up at him, touched by the gesture. "Michael, I can't accept this. It should stay in your family." "You are family now," Michael said simply. "Maybe not by blood, but by something just as important. By choice. By shared purpose." The words hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of how far they had come from that first hostile meeting in the Harrison Industries boardroom. Sarah carefully closed the case. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." They returned to the celebration where Frank was preparing to make a toast. The diner had fallen silent as he raised his glass. "To James Harrison," Frank said, his gruff voice thick with emotion, "who saw something in this old place worth saving. And to Eleanor Harrison, whose spirit lives on in what we're building here. May we always remember that good food, good company, and a place where everybody belongs never go out of style." "To James and Eleanor," the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Sarah found herself alone in the diner. The staff had gone home, exhausted but happy. Tomorrow would be the first official day of business for the new Blue Horizon. She walked slowly through the quiet space, turning off lights, straightening chairs, feeling the satisfaction of a day well spent. Finally, she came to booth 4. On impulse, she slid into the seat, running her fingers over the worn vinyl that had been carefully preserved amidst all the renovations. This was where it had all begun, where James Harrison, one of the most powerful men in Boston, had found solace in simplicity. Where Sarah Miller, a struggling waitress, had shown kindness without expectation of reward. She looked out the window at the quiet street just as James had done every morning. Was this what he had seen? A world rushing by, unaware of the lonely man watching from behind glass? A soft tap on the window startled her. An elderly man stood outside, peering in, his expression hopeful. Sarah recognized him as Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who lived in the neighborhood. She went to the door and opened it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jenkins. We're closed for the night." "I know, dear," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I just wanted to say how happy I am that the diner's open again. My wife and I came here every Sunday for 40 years before she passed. It'll be nice to have a place to go again." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "We'll be open for breakfast at 6. Your first cup of coffee is on the house." The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'll be here." He turned to go, then paused. "You know, there's something special about this place. Always has been. It's not just about the food. It's about belonging somewhere." As she watched him shuffle away, Sarah thought about James and Eleanor Harrison, about how a simple diner could be a sanctuary, about how small acts of kindness could echo across decades. Tomorrow she would welcome new customers and old friends. She would pour coffee and listen to stories. She would honor both the legacy she had inherited and the future she was helping to build. For now, though, she returned to booth 4 and placed a cup of black coffee and a plate with toast cut into 4 perfect squares on the table, a small tribute to the man who had changed her life by simply being seen. In the quiet of the empty diner, Sarah could almost hear James Harrison's voice. "The money is for your freedom. The diner is for your heart." He had been right. The money had freed her from financial worries, had given her mother the care she needed, had opened doors she never knew existed. But it was the diner, this humble place where people came together over coffee and conversation, that had given her purpose. Sarah Miller had inherited a fortune, but she had found something far more valuable, a legacy worth preserving, and a future worth building. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness, with toast cut into squares because an old man's hands trembled. Some fortunes can't be measured in dollars and cents. Some inheritances aren't listed in wills or legal documents. Sometimes the most valuable thing we can pass on is the reminder that in a world of bottom lines and balance sheets, it's still the human connection that matters most. James and Eleanor Harrison had understood that. Now so did Sarah. And through the Eleanor Harrison Foundation and the Blue Horizon Diner, countless others would learn it too. Sarah smiled, picked up the plate and cup, and carried them to the kitchen. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of possibilities and purpose. As the celebration continued, Sarah noticed a staff member wheeling in a special guest through the side entrance. Her heart swelled with joy at the sight of her mother, Catherine, looking better than she had in years. The specialized treatment had worked wonders, and while Catherine wasn't completely recovered, her improved strength allowed her to attend this momentous occasion. "Mom, you made it!" Sarah hurried over, bending down to embrace her. Catherine's eyes were bright with pride as she took in the renovated diner. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world, sweetheart." She squeezed Sarah's hand. "Your father would have been so proud." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her father, who had passed away when she was in high school. "I hope so." "Sarah," Michael's voice called from across the room. He navigated through the crowd, carrying 2 flutes of champagne. When he reached them, he smiled warmly at Catherine. "Mrs. Miller, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Sarah talks about you constantly." Over the past 6 months, Sarah and Michael had developed a relationship that surprised them both. What had begun as a tentative professional alliance had evolved into a genuine friendship. Their weekly planning meetings for the Eleanor Harrison Foundation often extended into dinners where they shared stories about their lives. Michael had opened up about his childhood, about the pain of losing his parents, and growing up under the shadow of his grandfather's expectations. Sarah had shared her struggles as an art student, trying to care for her sick mother while keeping their heads above water financially. They had discovered an unexpected kinship in their shared experiences of loss and responsibility. Though they came from vastly different worlds, they understood each other in ways few others could. Catherine studied Michael thoughtfully. "So you're the young man Sarah's been spending so much time with." Michael smiled, a hint of bashfulness breaking through his usual confidence. "Guilty as charged, Mrs. Miller." "Call me Catherine, please." She patted the seat next to her wheelchair. "Sit down and tell me about this foundation you two are building." As Michael settled beside Catherine, launching into an enthusiastic explanation of their latest initiative to provide culinary scholarships to underprivileged youth, Sarah watched them with a sense of wonder. This unlikely friendship with Michael had become one of the most meaningful relationships in her life. They challenged each other, supported each other, and shared a commitment to honoring the legacy they'd inherited. There was a comfortable ease between them, now the hostility of their first meeting long forgotten. They worked well together. Michael's business acumen complementing Sarah's intuitive understanding of community needs. Where he was strategic, she was empathetic. Where she was idealistic, he was practical. Victoria joined them, placing a gentle hand on Catherine's shoulder. "It's wonderful to finally meet Sarah's mother. She speaks of you with such admiration." The 4 of them formed an unlikely family unit bound not by blood, but by their connection to James and Eleanor Harrison and the legacy they all now shared in protecting. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Sarah found Michael standing alone by the wall of photographs, studying the picture of his grandparents in their youth. "Penny, for your thoughts," she asked, joining him. "I was just thinking about how strange life is," Michael said, not taking his eyes from the photo. "6 months ago, I hated you on principle." Sarah laughed. The feeling was mutual. "And now," he turned to her, his expression serious. "Now I can't imagine doing any of this without you," she said honestly. Michael smiled, the genuine smile that had become more frequent in recent months. "You know, when I was growing up, Grandfather would sometimes tell me stories about Eleanor, about how she could see the good in anyone, how she believed in second chances." He shook his head. "I always thought he was being sentimental. Now I think he was trying to teach me something I wasn't ready to hear. What's that? That true strength isn't in controlling everything and everyone around you. It's in being willing to be vulnerable, to connect. He gestured around the diner, to create places where people can belong. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. I think they would both be proud, not just of what we've built, but of who we're becoming. Michael's hand found hers, a brief, comforting touch that had become familiar between them. Not romantic, but something equally important. The touch of a true friend who had seen you at your worst and chosen to stay anyway. Partners, he asked. Partners, she confirmed with a smile. Bar Freeman appeared at their side, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. James would be pleased to see you two getting along so well. He always believed you'd be good for each other. Did he now? Michael raised an eyebrow. You never mentioned that before. Freeman chuckled. Some things are better discovered than told. He raised his glass. To James and Eleanor, and to the future they hoped for. To James and Eleanor. Sarah and Michael echoed their glasses clinking in the warm light of the diner that had brought them all together.